Hey everyone, here's a little snippet from the first book of my Through the Passageway series. I hope you like it. Eleanora had been angry that no one took her seriously as a witch. She had been part of the king's court in the city of Navib, the capital of the kingdom of Algera, as a healer to the king himself and those closest to him. But the king used her for more than just her magical ways of healing. On occasion, he would dress her up in unflattering, silly clothes made for a jester and parade her through the dining room during his lavish parties, where the richest and usually the snobbiest people were in attendance. She would be made to do tricks and show off little trinkets of magic that undermined her ability as a magic user and made her look like nothing more than a joke. Though she hated it, this was what her king commanded of her, and she had no other option but to obey. Over time, because of the king's mockery of Eleanora, others in the castle felt they had the right to make her life miserable. This even included the other servants who worked in the royal household. They would snicker as she walked by and call her names like King's Fool or the Witchy Clown. The names weren't enough for some of her tormentors, and before long they would physically bully her, pushing and shoving her as she walked by, sometimes going as far as to stick a foot out and trip her up, especially if she had her arms full, and send her and whatever she had been carrying tumbling to the ground. She tried to ignore them and their bullying ways, holding back her angry, frustrated tears until she was alone. She knew if she ever lashed out at the abuse the bullies hurled her way, she would be punished by the king. This fear is what kept Eleanora in check, forcing her to silently do whatever the king asked of her. She only ever wanted to use her magic for good. She aspired to be a fairy godmother of sorts and help people who truly deserved to have their wishes come true. If she were ever sent away, her dream would be stolen away from her. In her own private chambers in an unused part of the rather small fortress than what can be seen today, she was able to exist and work in relative peace. The chamber had been abandoned by all those who lived here, so the young witch took it for herself. Every so often the scrawny stable boy would come to visit. She found him annoying at times, especially when he talked at great length about how he could do a better job at ruling the kingdom than the current king. Yet she would never send him away, for he was the only one who showed her any sort of true kindness, even with all his faults. The stable boy would become in some way a friend to Eleanora, although she never realised just how devoted he was to her. Life carried on this way, practising her craft and her own savouring the moments of solitude, except for the occasional visit from the stable boy, until the day that Eleanora brought about the beginning of her own downfall into the darkness of evil. After an especially grueling day of tending to a sick child, and then a large dinner party where she had been made to be the clown yet again, Eleanora went to the kitchen to eat a hearty meal before retreating to her secluded living quarters. Thankfully for her, the kitchen was empty and she could eat in peace, but she wasn't to be left in peace for long. Before she could reach the safety of her living quarters, Eleanora stumbled across some particularly nasty bullies who worked in the fortress. "Hey look, it's the witchy clown," one of the women said sarcastically. Eleanora did not respond and simply kept walking, but one of the men stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Let me pass," Eleanora said, avoiding eye contact with the man. "But we want to talk to you," he said, pushing both his hands against her shoulders. This made Eleanora stumble backwards, yet she just about managed to stop herself from falling to the ground. As the other people gathered around her, they snickered, finding amusement on her behalf. "Do a trick for us, King's Fool," someone else said, pushing her from behind and making her lose her balance again. And then the bullies encircled her and began to push her around the space between them, laughing and poking fun, taunting her and demanding she do her tricks. "Leave me alone," Eleanora cried out, but no one listened. Instead, their insults flew faster and they pushed her around even more. Try she might, she could not repress the anger anymore, and with an ear-popping shriek that went on for longer than it should have, they stopped. All was silent for a few moments while Eleanor kept her eyes scrunched shut. Still standing amongst the bullies, she raised her hands and began to shriek again. This time, black smoke shot out of her fingers like bolts of lightning, the evil within them intended for the people that surrounded Eleanor. These lightning bolts, full of hate, hit each person that stood around Eleanor, and with a shriek of pain, they were lifted up off their feet and slammed back down to the ground. When she had calmed somewhat and felt back to her normal state, she saw the bullying servants lying motionless on the ground around her. Eleanor stared down at her hands in horror. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself. The guards that had seen what had happened were already rushing towards her. The guards pounced on the witch where she stood and dragged her away. In the damp, rat-infested dungeon, Eleanor knelt in the middle of the stone floor, arms held out at her sides by the manacle around each wrist and attached to metal chains that protruded from slabs of stone on either side of her. She was dirty, tired, hungry, and her eyes were swollen and red from crying. She had no idea how long she had been there, and had only begun to consider it when the cell door opened. She was on her feet as quickly as she could when the king stepped into the cell. "Please let me explain," Eleanor pleaded with him, but the king held up a hand to silence her. "Eleanor, I'm so disappointed with you," he scolded her. "There was no reason for you to lash out the way you did at those innocent people just trying to make a decent living. I thought you wanted to use your magic for good." "I do," Eleanor cried, "but you don't know what it's like for me living here. It's making my life miserable. Those people I lashed out at torture me. They bully me endlessly, like everyone does here. They were relentless and so cruel towards me. I was just so frustrated that I couldn't help it. It just came out. I didn't even know I was capable of something like that," Eleanor explained truthfully. "That is not true," said the king, shutting down her story of bullying. "Everyone loves you here. You are held in such high esteem. I have no idea where you are getting these delusions from, that people are mean to you, that they bully you. It's preposterous." The king had not realized he had raised his voice to the point that he was now shouting at her. She stared at him in utter shock. He could not see past the end of his nose and had no idea how badly she had been treated by everyone in the fortress, including himself. As far as the king was concerned, she lived a happy life here because of him. "That is how you want it to be, but it's not really how it is. You have to start listening to me," Eleanor shouted back. She could feel herself losing her temper, and the frustration was building up inside her just like it did before, when she set her power on those bullies. And just like with the bullies, Eleanor had no control over herself. She could not stop the frustrated anger from bubbling to the surface. "How dare you speak to your king like that?" the king snapped, having truly had enough of the young witch. "After all I have done for you, this is how you thank me?" "This is the last straw, Eleanor. Your life here ends today," the king told her, and he promptly turned to leave. Before he could even take one step towards the cell door, however, Eleanor raised her hands towards him. "No," she shrieked, and the smoky lightning that left her fingertips sparked with electricity as it lifted the king off the ground, several feet into the air before his body slammed to the floor. The two guards that had accompanied the king rushed into the cell, pointing their spears in Eleanor's direction, shaking in fear. They gazed worriedly down at the king's lifeless body before giving each other a sideways glance. Eleanor brought forth her lightning once more, crumpling their bodies to the ground next to the king. She knew she couldn't stay here, so she moved quietly across the cell floor and peered out the cell door as best she could to find that nobody was around. This was her chance. Turning back around, she clenched her fists and pulled her hands towards herself, breaking the chains in an awful clatter. All that was left were the shackles like bracelets around her wrists. Hearing footsteps approaching, Eleanor skipped out through the cell door before she could be discovered at the scene of the crime. She had to get out of the fortress as quickly as possible and as far away from Nabib as she could. Once out of the castle, she raced towards the stables, the evening sun low in the sky, and sure enough she found her friendly stable boy there. "I need your help," she panted as bells began to ring out throughout the city. "Eleanor, what have you done?" he asked, glancing warily at the shackles around her wrists. "There's no time to explain. I need to get out of here now." Eleanor was furiously desperate as the bells continued to ring and soldiers could be heard marching here and there. Then a booming voice announced, "The king is dead. I repeat, the king is dead." The words floated down to stables and Eleanor simply stared at her friend. Then the stable boy understood the witch's frantic behaviour. "Take Stan," he told her. "He's the fastest horse in the stable." Eleanor sprinted around to the horse's post and without even saddling him up, hopped on his back and raced away into the setting sun, just in time to save herself from the guilty verdict. With fear in her eyes and hatred in her heart, Eleanor made her way to the town of Srerib, and almost instantly her next move came to mind. There was a boat docked, due to set sail to the dark land across the sea. This, she decided, was her way out. Maybe going to this place that no one seemed to know much about would be a good idea. And though she had resisted it before, she realised if she were to survive in this world, she would have to learn about the dark side of magic. It would toughen her up and close her heart so she could execute her vengeance against those who had made her life miserable. And that is exactly what she did. I hope you enjoyed that, and let me know in the comments what you think.